boomer shooter. Gotta hate that term. Boomers didn't play shooters, or indeed any games. They were too busy stealing their children's features and comprehensively ruining the planet. Still, it seems to be sticking, so I guess we're just going to have to add another awful, non-indicative genre name to the list, alongside roguelike and Metroidvania. I bring up this little semi-relevant screed because my subject today, Prodeus, is possibly the purest encapsulation of the retro shooter revival you're ever going to find. There was a time when first-person shooters were referred to as Doom clones, and while that term is now seen as hopelessly quaint, I can't imagine any title deserving the label more than Prodeus. Pretty much everything in the game, from the weapons to most of the enemy designs, is lifted from classic Doom and given just enough of a new paint job to avoid running afoul of copyright. Prodeus takes place on some kind of space station that's been overrun by monsters. That's not me being reductive either. Prodeus's narrative, to use the term incredibly loosely, is confined entirely to a few short blurbs on the mission select screen that offer the vague outline of context. This isn't a FromSoft style storytelling situation either. There are no environmental clues or lore tidbits scattered around. Make no mistake, if you play Prodeus, you're there for old school shooter action with barely so much as a thought given to story, which admittedly is pretty faithful to the mentality of the games Prodeus is emulating. This dedication to recreation even extends to the graphics, which are probably Prodeus's most noteworthy feature. Rather than 3D models, Prodeus uses 2D sprites to create a sort of facsimile of 3D, the same technology as the very first shooters. Unlike those games though, this is a stylistic choice rather than a limit imposed by technology, so Prodeus's sprites are a great deal more reactive than the ones it's paying homage to. They suffer gory injuries as you damage them, and there's been a lot of effort put into providing them with enough sprites to simulate a variety of different angles. I'll confess to being a skeptic of this sort of early 3D revival. Maybe it's just not having grown up with it, but it still looks like garbage to me. But Prodeus is definitely putting the work in, if nothing else. Prodeus's gameplay is about as simple as these things get. You have a massive arsenal of weapons, there's an equally massive horde of monsters out for your blood, and you sort out the rest yourself. In keeping with the boomer shooter design philosophy, you move fast and soak up a lot of hits, so cover is a non-factor. Most of the action is at closer mid-range, and engagements predominantly take place in large arenas with multiple waves of enemies. The only real concession to modernity in the combat is the need to reload your weapons. Similarly, levels are sprawling, maze-like, and filled with secrets, both in the form of extra supply drops, collectibles, and ore. A fair chunk of Prodeus's content is locked behind a shop, and you can only purchase it with ore that you find in-game. There's a lot of ore to find and a lot of stuff to unlock, and some of them can only be found with the help of prior unlocks from the store, so if you want to buy everything the shop has to offer, you can expect to be replaying those levels quite a few times. I can get behind the idea, but I definitely felt like some of the features probably should have been a standard part of the game. Unlockable bonus weapons are one thing, but the double jump and dash are really important in such a fast-paced combat system, and I'd rather have been given them from the jump rather than have to grind for them. Speaking of weapons, they do a rip straight from the standard boomer shooter playbook. Minigun, rocket launcher, dual machine guns, a legally distinct version of Doom's super shotgun, token energy weapons, and so on. They're divided into 4 different ammo types, so you can expect to have to juggle them around often to avoid running dry. You're given the basic weapons on the house over the campaign, while more exotic ones are locked behind the shop. Not to go off on a tangent, but why do old school shooters seem to think the ability to detonate rockets midair is some kind of super useful ability? The Doom reboot pulled this too, and I find it just as baffling there. If you want to do indirect splash damage, just aim at the ground, it's not hard. So yeah, all of this is basically what you'd expect. One major discrepancy I did find was in the difficulty. Not so much the difficulty in and of itself, but how the game handles failure. When you die in Prodeus, rather than having to reload a checkpoint or restart the level, you just pop right back in where you left off. No strings attached, enemies don't even respawn. It's a weird design choice for a genre that's historically prized challenging gameplay. Granted, this was on the default difficulty setting. I'm sure there's alternative gameplay modes that opt for a more punishing failure state, but it still stuck out to me as an odd move. Other than that though, Prodeus is basically boomer shooter the boomer shooter, and to be honest, that's kind of my problem with it. Prodeus does a good job replicating an old school FPS for sure, but that's really all it does. Not to echo my criticism of Mortal Shell, but Prodeus feels like a tribute act, albeit one that's considerably less technically impressive. Prodeus feels like it should have some kind of unique angle, but it just doesn't. I don't want to use the term nostalgia bait, but as as someone who's a little too young to experience this genre in its prime, that was kind of the impression I came away with. I have no real attachment to the titles Prodeus is emulating, so I was left feeling a bit underwhelmed. The whole affair just feels rather bare bones compared to modern fare. You spend a few hours reducing monsters to chunky salsa with some big guns, and that's that. If I were trying to argue the merits of video games as a medium to a skeptic, Prodeus is not the game I would point to, let's put it that way. And it's not like Prodeus is even particularly unique in its premise. The original Doom has been basically ported to everything with a screen at this point, and classic-inspired indie boomer shooters have been having a renaissance in the last few years. A recurring thought I had while playing Prodeus was, haven't we moved past this? Contextless gore might have been novel in the 90s, but in the 2020s I found Prodeus rather lacking. Even the Doom reboot gave things a bit more narrative meat. I can admire a purity of vision to a point, but like I said, I don't have any nostalgia for this genre, and this game came out in 2022, so I'm going to judge it according to those standards. At its core, Prodeus feels like a skeleton in need of flesh. The core mechanics are solid enough, and it succeeds admirably in replicating the look and feel of its predecessors, but it has nothing going for it beyond that. If you want to slaughter hordes of monsters or go on a 90s shooter nostalgia trip, Prodeus will scratch that itch, but don't expect much else.